The morning of June 16, 1904, began at the Motello Tower, a round stone fortress standing on the edge of Dublin Bay. The sea stretched out beyond it, grey-green and endless, breathing its salt air across the rocky shore. Inside this tower lived 3 young men, and as the sun rose over Ireland, one of them climbed to the rooftop to begin the day. His name was Buck Mulligan, and he was stout and merry, full of energy and irreverent humor. He carried a bowl of lather and a mirror, preparing to shave in the open air. As he looked out over the water, he intoned mock seriously, "In troibo ad altare Dei," the Latin words that begin the Catholic Mass, turning the sacred into comedy, as was his way. Below, still in bed, lay Stephen Dedalus, a thin young man with thoughtful eyes and a poet's temperament. He was 22 years old, but he carried the weight of someone much older. His mother had died recently, and her death haunted him, not with simple grief, but with guilt and questions about faith, duty, and what we owe to those who loved us. Stephen rose slowly and climbed to the roof where Mulligan was shaving, the morning light catching in the bowl of white lather. The 2 young men were friends, but it was a complicated friendship. Mulligan was all surface brilliance and casual mockery, while Stephen lived in the depths of his own thoughts, nursing wounds that Mulligan couldn't understand. "Ow, poor dog's body," Mulligan said cheerfully when he saw Stephen. He meant it affectionately, but the words stung nonetheless. Everything Mulligan said had a double edge, friendly and cutting at once. They spoke of various things as the morning unfolded. Mulligan joked about the sea, calling it our great sweet mother in mock poetic tones. He talked about their living arrangement, about the 3rd man who shared the tower, an Englishman named Haynes who studied Irish culture but didn't really understand it. But beneath Mulligan's cheerful banter, Stephen felt the tension of their relationship. Mulligan had said something cruel about Stephen's mother, had mocked her death, her dying request that Stephen pray for her. And Stephen, who had refused to kneel at his mother's deathbed, who had denied her final wish because he could not be a hypocrite about faith he didn't feel, carried this refusal like a stone in his chest. The guilt was complicated. He hadn't loved her less by refusing to pray. In some ways, he had honored her more by being honest. But try telling that to guilt, which doesn't listen to logic, which only knows that a mother asked and a son said no. As they descended from the tower to have breakfast, Stephen felt himself caught between worlds. He was too serious for Mulligan's easy mockery, too intellectual for simple faith, too proud to go home to his father's house, too poor to truly be independent. He was, as the episode's title suggested, a Telemachus, a young man waiting to come into his own, living in someone else's space. The tower was rented in Mulligan's name, uncertain of his path forward. They ate breakfast simply, bread and honey, tea. The old woman who brought the milk seemed to Stephen like Ireland itself, serving those who occupied her space, not quite belonging to herself. Haynes, the Englishman, spoke to her in Irish, trying to claim a connection to a culture that wasn't his, while she, who actually was Irish, could barely understand the ancient language. After breakfast, Stephen prepared to leave for his work. He taught at a school, a job he found stifling but needed for the meager income. Mulligan asked him for the key to the tower, and Stephen gave it to him, though he knew somehow that he wouldn't be returning to sleep there again. He was surrendering his place, letting Mulligan take full possession, recognizing that he had never truly belonged there anyway. As Stephen walked away from the tower, down toward the road that would take him to his teaching job, he carried with him all his complicated feelings: grief for his mother, resentment toward Mulligan, uncertainty about his future, the burden of being young and talented but unrecognized, of having artistic ambitions but no clear path to fulfill them. The sea continued its eternal breathing behind him. The morning continued its slow unfolding. And Stephen walked into the day that would become one of the most famous days in literature. June 16, 1904, the day that Leopold Bloom would wander through Dublin, and their paths would eventually cross. But for now, in this first hour of this long day, there was just a young man walking away from a tower, carrying his grief and his pride, his learning and his uncertainty, stepping forward into a future he couldn't yet imagine but that waited for him nonetheless. Stephen Dedalus arrived at the school in Dalkey where he taught, a modest private academy run by an old unionist named Mr. Deasy. The morning lesson was history, and Stephen stood before a classroom of restless boys, trying to teach them about ancient Greece, about Pyrrhus and his victories that came at such terrible cost. The boys were only half listening, their minds wandering as young minds do. Stephen asked them questions about the ancient battles, and they answered with the distracted certainty of children who have memorized facts without understanding them. One boy, Cochrane, struggled more than the others, his face flushing with the effort of trying to remember what he had been told. Stephen felt a wave of sympathy for this struggling student. He saw in the boy's awkwardness something of himself, the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit. After class, he stayed with Cochrane, patiently helping him with his arithmetic, showing him how numbers could be understood rather than merely feared. When the lesson finally ended and the boys rushed out to play hockey on the field, Stephen remained inside to collect his wages from Mr. Deasy. The old headmaster sat in his study surrounded by shells and relics, the accumulated artifacts of a long life spent in certainty about how the world worked. Mr. Deasy counted out Stephen's meagre salary, £3, 12 shillings, and launched into a lecture about money, about saving, about the importance of being practical. "Put but money in thy purse," he said, quoting Shakespeare but missing the irony that the line came from the villain Iago. The old man spoke with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his own assumptions. He shared his opinions about history, about Ireland's troubles, about the Jews, opinions that were casual prejudices dressed up as wisdom. Stephen listened politely, recognizing that Mr. Deasy represented a certain kind of Ireland. Protestant, Unionist, looking backward to British rule, comfortable with his own certainties. "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake," Stephen said quietly, one of those crystalline moments of truth that occasionally broke through his thoughts into speech. Mr. Deasy didn't understand. He had his own view of history, that it moved toward one great goal, the manifestation of God. Everything had purpose and direction in his orderly universe. As Stephen prepared to leave, Mr. Deasy asked him to deliver a letter to the newspaper editors, a letter about foot and mouth disease in cattle, the old man's current preoccupation. Stephen agreed, folding the letter into his pocket. Another burden to carry through this day. Walking away from the school, past the boys playing their game on the field, Stephen felt the weight of these encounters. The struggling student, the pompous headmaster, the casual prejudices, the small salary that barely sustained him. All of it was part of the world he inhabited but didn't belong to, the nightmare of history from which he sought to awaken. The morning continued its slow progression. Ahead lay Dublin and whatever the rest of this June day would bring. After leaving Mr. Deasy's school, Stephen walked alone to Sandymount Strand, the long beach where the sea met the land in an endless conversation of waves and sand. He had thought about visiting his aunt and uncle who lived nearby, but the idea filled him with reluctance. They would ask questions, make judgments, remind him of family obligations he couldn't fulfill. So instead he walked the beach, alone with his thoughts and the rhythm of the waves. Stephen closed his eyes as he walked, testing a philosophical question. If I can't see the world, does it still exist? His boots crunched on shells and sand, proof that something was there beneath him even when unseen. He opened his eyes again. The world returned, or rather, had never left. Only his perception of it had changed. Everything around him seemed to shift and transform like Proteus, the Greek god who could change his shape. The strand itself was never the same twice. The tide moved in and out, the scent shifted, the light changed moment by moment. Nothing was fixed, everything flowed. Stephen's mind wandered through memories and sensations. He thought about his time in Paris, about coming home when his mother fell ill, about his poverty and his ambitions. He watched a dog running along the beach, free and purposeful, and envied its simple existence. He saw a couple in the distance, a man and woman, cockle pickers gathering food from the shore. They reminded him of the basic human struggle for survival, so different from his own struggle with ideas and art and meaning. The sea continued its patient work, moving in and out, like breath itself. Stephen picked up a piece of driftwood and wrote something in the sand, knowing the tide would erase it. Everything was temporary, everything transformed. He thought about time, how it moved forward inexorably, how each moment died as the next was born, how we are always becoming something other than what we were. His philosophical education had taught him words for these ideas, ineluctable modality of the visible, the Nakayananda and Nabanayananda of existence. But the beach taught him something simpler, that everything changes, that nothing remains, that we are all part of this great transformation. As noon approached, Stephen turned away from the strand, his solitary meditation complete. He had walked through his thoughts as he walked through the sand, both leaving and being shaped by the journey. The beach would remain, eternal and ever-changing, long after he had gone. Dublin awaited him, with its crowds and its noise and its demands. But for this hour, he had been alone with the sea and his thoughts, watching the world transform around him, feeling himself transform within it. While Stephen Dedalus had been at the Martello Tower greeting the morning, another man was beginning his day across the city in a modest house on Eccles Street. His name was Leopold Bloom, and he was preparing breakfast for his wife. Bloom was 38 years old, an advertisement canvasser who moved through Dublin selling space in newspapers and programs. He was an ordinary man in many ways, neither particularly successful nor particularly unsuccessful, neither heroic nor cowardly, simply human in all his complexity and ordinariness. This morning, like most mornings, he rose before his wife Molly and went downstairs to prepare her breakfast. He was a considerate husband, taking pleasure in small acts of care. He put the kettle on for tea, then stepped outside to visit the butcher shop on the corner, planning to buy a pork kidney for his own breakfast. The morning was warming up already. Summer in Dublin carried the promise of heat, though the city rarely grew truly hot. Bloom walked with a purposeful stride, thinking about many things as he walked: the coming day, his work, a letter he was expecting. At the butcher's shop, he noticed a servant girl from a neighboring house. She moved with unconscious grace, and Bloom watched her with appreciative but not unkind eyes. He was a man who noticed beauty in women, yes, but also in clouds, in the play of light on water, in the small details of daily life that most people overlooked. He purchased his kidney and returned home, finding the morning mail had arrived. Among the letters was one addressed to his wife, from Blazes Boylan, a flashy, confident man who worked in the music business. Bloom knew that Boylan was organizing a concert tea for Molly, who had a fine singing voice. He knew this, and he also knew something else, something he didn't want to examine too closely, that Boylan was coming to visit Molly that very afternoon, at 4 o'clock. The knowledge sat in his mind like a weight he couldn't set down. But Bloom was skilled at redirecting his thoughts, at finding other things to occupy his attention. He prepared the kidney, enjoying the smell as it cooked, then carried the breakfast tray up to Molly. She was still in bed, warm and comfortable, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She was a sensual woman, comfortable in her body, and Bloom loved her despite everything, despite knowing what he knew. They talked casually about the day ahead. She mentioned Boylan's visit, casually, as if it were nothing special. Bloom asked about a word from her concert program, affecting ignorance, letting her explain, creating a moment of connection through this small exchange. After breakfast, Bloom retreated to the outdoor privy with a magazine, a moment of peaceful solitude. He sat reading about a wonder walker in a distant land, about exotic places and possibilities. His mind wandered to thoughts of travel, of escape, of other lives he might have lived. But then he returned to the house, to the reality of his actual life, a life that contained joy and sorrow, love and loneliness, fidelity and betrayal all mixed together. He would go out into Dublin today, would wander its streets, would attend a funeral, would conduct his business, would eventually return home to whatever awaited him. For now, the morning was still young, still full of possibility. Bloom prepared to leave the house, stepping out into the June day that would become one of the most famous days in literature. A day of wandering, of small encounters, of inner thoughts and outer actions all woven together into the fabric of ordinary extraordinary life. Leopold Bloom walked through the morning streets of Dublin with a particular destination in mind, the post office on Westland Row, where a letter awaited him under a secret name. For Bloom had a small secret, a harmless one really, a correspondence with a woman named Martha Clifford. They had never met in person, only exchanged letters through the personals column of a newspaper. He wrote to her as Henry Flower, and she wrote back with flirtatious, misspelled notes that entertained him and gave him something to think about besides the realities of his life. At the post office, he collected the letter with a small thrill of anticipation, then walked on, saving it to read later, prolonging the pleasure of expectation. As he wandered, Bloom passed through a city full of small distractions and escapes. He stopped to help a blind young man cross the street, guiding him gently, thinking about what it must be like to live in darkness. He encountered an acquaintance named McCoy, who talked at length while Bloom's attention drifted, watching a woman climb into a carriage and catching a glimpse of her ankle. These were Bloom's lotus flowers, small pleasures and distractions that eased the passage of time, that made life bearable, that helped him avoid thinking too much about 4 o'clock that afternoon when Blazes Boylan would visit his wife. He passed by a church and, curious, stepped inside during a service. Bloom was Jewish by heritage, though not particularly observant, and Molly was Catholic, though equally casual about faith. He watched the ritual with an outsider's interest, noting the details, the priest's Latin, the communicants receiving the host, the women in their Sunday clothes. The church offered its own kind of lotus, the comfort of ritual, the promise of transcendence, the temporary forgetting of worldly troubles. Bloom understood the appeal even if he didn't share the belief. Leaving the church, he finally opened Martha's letter. It was sweet and silly, full of longing and awkward phrases. She asked if he could meet her, called him naughty, worried that he might be unfaithful to their correspondence. The irony wasn't lost on Bloom. This woman worried about his fidelity while his actual wife prepared to receive another man. He stopped at a chemist's shop to order a face lotion for Molly. One more small act of care. One more gesture of love despite everything. As the chemist prepared the order, Bloom's mind wandered to thoughts of chemistry, of transformation, of how substances could change their nature. His final destination this morning was the bathhouse. He had been thinking about it all along, anticipating the pleasure of warm water, of floating weightless, of temporary escape from the gravity of his thoughts and worries. At the Turkish bath, Bloom undressed and eased himself into the hot water. The heat enveloped him, loosening his muscles, quieting his mind. He floated there in the steam and warmth, feeling his body relax, his thoughts drift. This was the ultimate lotus flower, the bath that dissolved the boundaries of self, that offered temporary oblivion, that let a man forget for a little while about betrayal and loneliness and all the small sorrows that accumulate in a life. Bloom closed his eyes and let the water hold him, thinking drowsy thoughts, feeling himself drift in the warm embrace of temporary peace. After his peaceful bath, Leopold Bloom's morning took a more somber turn. He was attending a funeral, that of Paddy Dignarm, an acquaintance who had drunk himself to death, leaving behind a widow and children. It was the kind of sad, ordinary tragedy that happened all too often in Dublin. Bloom joined 3 other men in a carriage that would carry them to Glasnevin Cemetery. There was Martin Cunningham, a kind man with troubles of his own, Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, full of stories and complaints, and Mr. Power, solid and conventional. The 4 men sat together as the carriage moved through Dublin's streets, passing from the world of the living toward the world of the dead. As they rode, they talked, the way men do at funerals, speaking of everything and nothing, using words to fill the uncomfortable silence that death creates. They spoke of other deaths they had known, other funerals they had attended. Simon Dedalus mentioned a recent suicide, then caught himself, remembering too late that Bloom's own father had taken his own life years before. An awkward silence followed. The men shifted in their seats, not knowing what to say. Bloom felt the weight of their discomfort and his own memory. His father, Rudolf Bloom, who had poisoned himself, leaving a note that Leopold still remembered word for word. The carriage passed through different neighborhoods, and Bloom looked out the window, observing the living city even as they traveled toward the cemetery. He saw a bargeman on the canal, eating his lunch without a care. He saw children playing, women shopping, all the ordinary business of life continuing while they journeyed to bury the dead. At one point, they passed a man in a brown mackintosh, a mysterious figure who would appear and reappear throughout this day, never quite identified, always just at the edge of vision. The carriage also passed through the Jewish quarter, and Bloom thought about his heritage, about being neither quite Irish nor quite Jewish, belonging fully to neither world, always somehow on the outside looking in. The other men in the carriage were Catholic, part of the majority, comfortable in their belonging in a way Bloom never quite felt. They arrived at Glasnevin Cemetery, where the dead of Dublin rested in neat rows, their stories reduced to names and dates on stone. The cemetery was vast, containing generations of Dubliners, patriots and paupers, heroes and ordinary folk, all equal now in death. The funeral party gathered around the grave as the priest performed the burial rites. Bloom watched with his characteristic mixture of sympathy and detachment. He thought about the mechanics of burial, about what happens to bodies in the earth, about decomposition and decay. His mind worked this way, practical, curious, unable to hide behind comforting abstractions. He also thought about his own losses. His father, certainly, but more painfully, his son Rudy, who had lived only 11 days before dying. That was 15 years ago now, but the grief never fully left. It had changed shape, become part of the landscape of Bloom's inner life, but it was always there. As he stood at Dignam's grave, Bloom thought about Rudy as he would have been, a boy of 11 now, if he had lived. What would he have been like? What games would he play? What questions would he ask? The might have been haunted Bloom more than he let anyone know. The other mourners spoke in low voices about Dignam, about his drinking, about the family he'd left behind. They would take up a collection to help the widow, as people did. Life would go on for the living, while Dignam descended into the earth to join all those who had gone before. Martin Cunningham approached Bloom and spoke kindly to him, acknowledging without words the difficulty of attending a funeral when one carried one's own griefs. Cunningham was a good man who understood suffering. His own wife was an alcoholic who made his life miserable, yet he bore it with patient dignity. As the funeral concluded and people began to drift away, Bloom walked among the graves, reading inscriptions, thinking about mortality and memory. Some stones were well tended, visited regularly by the living who remembered. Others were crumbling and forgotten, their names already fading, their stories lost to time. He thought about how we try to keep the dead alive through memory, through ritual, through stones with names carved in them. But eventually, everyone is forgotten. The cemetery itself was proof of this. Thousands of graves, but who remembered them all? Who came to tend them, to speak their names, to recall who they had been? Yet there was something comforting too about the cemetery's democracy. Rich and poor, successful and failed, beloved and lonely, all came to the same end, all returned to the same earth. In death, at least, there was equality. Bloom left the cemetery and walked back toward the center of Dublin, leaving the dead to their eternal rest. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, and with it, the knowledge that drew ever closer. 4 o'clock, when Bolin would visit Molly, when his own small death would occur in the marriage bed he shared with his wife. But for now, he walked among the living, grateful for breath and movement and the June sunshine on his face. The funeral had reminded him that life, however painful, was still life, still precious, still worth living, still full of small pleasures and observations that made the journey worthwhile. The city opened before him, full of people going about their business, each carrying their own griefs and hopes, their own memories of the dead, their own awareness of mortality walking beside them like a shadow in the sunlight. After the quiet solemnity of the cemetery, Leopold Bloom found himself in a very different world. The noisy, bustling offices of the Freeman's Journal and Evening Telegraph, Dublin's newspapers. The building hummed with activity, with voices raised and papers rustling, with the mechanical clatter of printing presses in the basement sending vibrations through the floors. Bloom had come here on business. He worked as an advertisement canvasser, selling space in the newspapers to businesses who wanted to reach customers. Today he was trying to secure a renewal for an advertisement from Alexander Keyes, a tea and wine merchant. It was the kind of mundane commercial work that kept Bloom and his household afloat, neither glamorous nor particularly lucrative, but necessary. The newspaper office was presided over by an editor named Miles Crawford, a man whose moods shifted like the winds, who could be charming one moment and cutting the next. He sat in his office holding court, surrounded by journalists, idlers, and hangers-on, all of them talking, arguing, telling stories, filling thee with words. Bloom navigated this world with his characteristic patience and practicality. He needed to arrange for the advertisement design to be delivered, needed to get Crawford's approval, needed to manage the details that would make the sale work. But Crawford was distracted, caught up in conversations about politics and literature and the state of Irish journalism. Into this busy scene came Stephen Dedalus, carrying Mr. Deese's letter about foot and mouth disease. He had been sent to deliver it to the newspapers, though he felt little enthusiasm for the task. Stephen moved through the office like a ghost, observing but not quite participating, his mind elsewhere even as his body occupied space among these loud, confident men. The journalists and editors told stories. That was what they did. After all, they spoke of great speeches they had witnessed, of famous orators like Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell, who had stirred Irish hearts with their words. They debated the power of rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the magic of language that could move multitudes. One man, Professor Mackhew, told the story of a classical speech about Moses leading his people through the desert. The ancient orator had made his audience feel the sand beneath their feet, the sun on their faces, the longing for the promised land. That was the power of great rhetoric, to transport people, to make them feel and believe. Another told the tale of an Irish journalist who had witnessed the Phoenix Park murders years before, a terrible political assassination that had shocked the nation. He described how this journalist had rushed to file his report, how the words had poured out of him in the urgency of the moment, how journalism at its best captured the raw truth of events. All this talk of words and wind filled the office. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a story, everyone wanted to be heard. It was like the cave of Aeolus, the god of winds in Homer's Odyssey, where all the winds were kept in bags, ready to blow ships off course. Stephen listened to these older men with their confident stories about Irish greatness, about the power of words, about the glorious past. But he felt alienated from their certainty, from their easy nationalism, from their assumption that Ireland's story was one simple narrative. His relationship to Ireland was more complicated, more troubled. He saw the paralysis as well as the potential, the failures as well as the dreams. Bloom, meanwhile, continued trying to manage his business, moving between the office and the telephone, making calls, arranging details. He was the practical man among all these talkers, the one actually trying to accomplish something concrete. But in this environment, his practicality seemed almost invisible. The storytellers dominated, their voices rising and falling like wind. At one point, the group decided to leave the office and walk to a pub. Stephen went with them, drawn along by the current of their movement. Bloom was left behind, still trying to finalize his advertisement business, still dealing with the mundane necessities that others could afford to ignore. As they walked, the journalists continued their talk. Someone mentioned seeing a woman earlier, a beautiful woman in cream dress. They said, though they couldn't agree on the details. Had she been wearing grey cream? Were they talking about the same woman at all? The winds of words blew this way and that, never quite settling on truth. Stephen, walking among them but apart, thought about how words could be both powerful and empty. These men spoke eloquently about Ireland and freedom and greatness, but what did their words actually accomplish? They talked endlessly while the country remained paralyzed, caught in old patterns, unable to move forward. He thought about making his own kind of art, his own kind of speech, not political rhetoric journalism, but something something that would capture life as it really was, not as people wished it to be. But he was still searching for his voice, still uncertain how to transform his observations and insights into the art he dreamed of creating. Back at the newspaper office, Bloom discovered that his carefully arranged advertisement deal was falling apart. Crawford had changed his mind in Bloom's absence, had decided not to approve the renewal. All Bloom's patient work, all his practical arrangements, had come to nothing. blown away by the editor's shifting winds of mood. It was a small defeat, one of many that ordinary life contained. Bloom accepted it with his characteristic resilience. There would be other advertisements, other attempts, other days. This was how he lived, moving forward despite setbacks, finding small pleasures despite disappointments, maintaining his dignity even when others dismissed him. The episode ended with motion and noise, people coming and going, voices rising and falling, the printing presses continuing their mechanical rhythm in the basement. Everyone talking, everyone in motion, but nothing quite resolved, nothing quite accomplished. Just words and wind, sound and fury, the eternal Dublin conversation that circled back on itself without quite reaching any destination. The afternoon was progressing. 4 o'clock drew nearer. But for now, there was just this moment. The newspaper office with its energy and emptiness, its words and wind, its stories that entertained but didn't quite transform, its endless talk that filled the air without quite changing anything. It was early afternoon now, and Leopold Bloom found himself hungry. The funeral, the newspaper office, the morning's wanderings, all had taken their toll, and his body reminded him that it needed sustenance. It was time for lunch, that most democratic and necessary of rituals. But first, as he walked through Dublin's streets, Bloom encountered a young man distributing religious pamphlets about a coming charity bazaar. The young man pressed a throwaway leaflet into Bloom's hand, and Bloom, ever curious, glanced at it before crumpling it and tossing it into the river Liffey. The paper floated downstream, and Bloom watched it go, thinking about how all things flow away, how the river carries everything toward the sea. He passed by the charitable soup kitchen where Dublin's poor lined up for free food. Bloom observed them with compassion, thinking about hunger, about poverty, about how fragile the line was between comfort and destitution. He himself had known lean times, understood what it meant to worry about money, to calculate every expense. As he walked, memories surfaced, particularly memories of Molly, of their courtship, of happier times. He remembered a day on Howth Head, a hill overlooking Dublin Bay, when Molly had fed him seed cake from her mouth in a moment of sensual intimacy that still glowed in his memory like a perfect jewel. That was 16 years ago, when they were young and everything seemed possible. They had been happy then, truly happy. What had changed? Many things, he supposed. The death of their son Rudy had wounded something fundamental in their relationship. The years had accumulated their disappointments and compromises. And now there was Boylan, coming today at 4 o'clock, another wand being prepared. Bloom's hunger grew more insistent, pulling him from these melancholy thoughts. He considered various restaurants, Burton's, where men ate messily and ladly, Davy Byrne's, a quieter establishment. He passed Burton's and looked inside, immediately repulsed by the sight and sound of men devouring their food like animals. The Lastrygonians of Homer's Odyssey were man-eating giants, and these diners reminded Bloom of them, all appetite, all consumption, nothing refined or dignified about it. He moved on to Davy Byrne's instead, a moral pub as people called it, a place with some sense of decorum. Inside, it was quieter, more civilized. Bloom ordered a glass of Burgundy and a Gorgonzola cheese sandwich, simple fare, but it would satisfy his hunger without making him feel heavy and sluggish for the afternoon ahead. As he ate, slowly and thoughtfully, Bloom's mind continued its characteristic wandering. He thought about food and digestion, about what happened to the things we consumed, about the chemistry of the body. His mind worked this way, practical, curious, following chains of thought from the concrete to the abstract and back again. He thought about different kinds of hunger, physical hunger, certainly, but also other appetites. Sexual hunger, which both troubled and defined so much of human behavior. The hunger for connection, for meaning, for something beyond the daily grind of existence. Other men came and went in the pub, some greeting Bloom, others ignoring him. He was known around Dublin but not quite part of any particular group, not quite Irish enough for the nationalists, not quite Jewish enough for the small Jewish community, not quite successful enough to command real respect. He occupied a middle ground, observing more than participating, thinking more than speaking. One of the men mentioned seeing Blazes Boylan earlier, looking prosperous and confident. The name struck Bloom like a small knife, though he kept his face neutral. 4 o'clock was drawing closer. Only a few hours now until his wife would receive her visitor, until the thing he knew but didn't quite let himself know would happen. To distract himself, Bloom thought about other things. He thought about women he saw on the street, not with crude desire, but with appreciation and curiosity. He noticed how they moved, what they wore, what small gestures revealed about their inner lives. He wondered about their thoughts, their dreams, their private sufferings and joys. He thought about Mrs. Pufoy, a woman he knew who had been in labor for 3 days now, struggling to bring a child into the world. The thought filled him with sympathy and a kind of wonder at what women endured, the physical reality of birth that men could never fully understand. Finishing his modest lunch, Bloom paid and stepped back out into Dublin's streets. The afternoon sun was warm, and people moved about their business with the lazy energy of a summer day. He had time still before he needed to return home, time to fill with errands and wanderings, time to delay the knowledge of 4 o'clock. He decided to visit the National Library to look up an old advertisement, a task he could justify as work-related, though really it was just another way to fill time, to keep moving, to avoid thinking too much about what he couldn't control. As he walked toward the library, Bloom's hunger was satisfied, but his deeper hungers remained. The hunger for love that wasn't complicated by betrayal, the hunger for respect and belonging, the hunger for meaning in a life that sometimes felt like nothing more than a series of small defeats and temporary pleasures. But Bloom was resilient in his way. He kept walking, kept observing, kept finding small things to interest and occupy him. A cloud passing across the sun. A woman's laughter from an open window. The smell of coffee from a cafe. The world continued to offer these small gifts, and Bloom continued to receive them with gratitude, even as the larger sorrows of his life accumulated like shadows at the edges of his vision. The afternoon unfolded around him, full of people and movement and life. Somewhere, Stephen Dedalus was pursuing his own path through Dublin. Somewhere, Molly was at home, preparing for her 4 o'clock visitor. Somewhere, all the threads of this June day were weaving together toward whatever revelation or disaster awaited. But for now, there was just Bloom walking through Dublin, his hunger satisfied, his thoughts wandering, his heart somehow still open to the world despite everything it had endured. While Leopold Bloom wandered the streets thinking about hunger and memory, Stephen Dedalus found himself in a very different setting, the National Library of Ireland, surrounded by books and scholars, engaged in a battle of ideas rather than a search for lunch. Stephen had been invited to the librarian's office to discuss his theory about Shakespeare, a theory he had been developing and refining, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. It was an intellectual exercise, a way of proving his cleverness, a performance for an audience of Dublin's literary men. The office was crowded with listeners. There was John Eglinton, the librarian, an essayist, skeptical and sardonic. There was the poet A.E. George Russell, mystical and vague, always floating in clouds of spiritual abstractions. There was Thomas Leicester, the Quaker librarian, kind and quiet. And there was Buck Mulligan, Stephen's false friend, who arrived late and immediately began to mock and undermine. Stephen's theory was this: that Shakespeare's great plays, particularly Hamlet, were autobiographical, not in simple ways, but in deep psychological patterns. Shakespeare had been betrayed, Stephen argued, by his wife Anne Hathaway and his brothers. The ghost of Hamlet's father was Shakespeare himself, calling out from beyond the grave of his younger self, warning his son about betrayal, about the wounds that women and family could inflict. It was a theory built on carefully selected facts from Shakespeare's life mixed with creative interpretation. Stephen wove together biography and textual analysis, psychology and speculation, creating an elaborate edifice of ideas that was brilliant whether or not it was true. As Stephen spoke, he navigated between two dangers, like Odysseus sailing between Scylla, the six-headed monster, and Charybdis, the deadly whirlpool. On one side was the danger of pure mysticism, of losing oneself in abstractions and symbols like A did, floating away from concrete reality. On the other side was the danger of crude materialism, of reducing art to mere biography, of losing the mystery in the facts. Stephen tried to sail between these extremes, maintaining a middle course that acknowledged both the material circumstances of Shakespeare's life and the transcendent power of his art. But it was difficult, treacherous navigation, and Stephen wasn't always sure he succeeded. The others questioned and challenged him. Eglinton was skeptical. Did it really matter what Shakespeare's personal life was like? Wasn't the art itself what mattered? A wanted to talk about universal symbols and spiritual truths, impatient with Stephen's focus on biographical details. Leicester listened kindly, asking gentle questions that revealed gaps in Stephen's argument. And Mulligan, when he arrived, immediately began to mock. He made jokes, told scandalous stories, tried to turn the serious intellectual discussion into farce. This was what he always did. Deflated pretension, punctured solemnity, refused to let anything be taken too seriously. It was his way of asserting dominance, of reminding everyone that he was clever too, perhaps cleverer than Stephen with his elaborate theories. Stephen felt the familiar pain of Mulligan's mockery. They had been friends, or something like friends, but Mulligan didn't understand the seriousness of Stephen's artistic ambitions. To Mulligan, everything was a game. Everything was material for jokes. He couldn't grasp that for Stephen, art and ideas were matters of life and death, the only way to escape the paralysis of Dublin, the only hope for transcendence. As Stephen continued his performance, because that's what it was, really, a performance of intellectual brilliance, his mind divided. Part of him spoke eloquently about Shakespeare, spinning out his theory with confidence and flair. But another part observed himself speaking, wondered if he believed any of it, questioned why he was trying so hard to impress these men, most of whom he didn't even respect. He thought about his father, Simon Dedalus, whom he had seen that morning at the funeral. His father, who had once been a gentleman but was now a drunk, living on memories and complaints. Stephen saw in Shakespeare's relationship with his father, whatever it had actually been, a mirror of his own struggle. How do we honor our fathers while also becoming ourselves? How do we acknowledge our origins while transcending them? He thought about mothers too, his own mother who had died, whose memory tormented him with guilt, and Shakespeare's mother Mary, about whom so little was known. And he thought about Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife, whom Stephen cast as betrayer in his theory. Were all women potential betrayers? Was this just misogyny disguised as literary criticism? Stephen himself wasn't sure. The discussion continued, circling around questions that had no definitive answers. What is the relationship between an artist's life and their art? Can we know the creator through their creation? What survives death? The body, the soul, the works we leave behind? At one point, as Stephen was speaking, the door opened and Leopold Bloom entered the library, passing through on his own errand. Stephen barely noticed him, just another middle-aged man, nobody important, another one of Dublin's anonymous citizens. But Bloom noticed Stephen, recognized him from the morning, observed the young man holding forth in the librarian's office. For a moment, their paths crossed, though they didn't speak. The older man and the younger, both wandering through Dublin, both searching for something they couldn't quite name, both isolated in different ways, Bloom by circumstance and heritage, Stephen by choice and temperament. Bloom passed on, and Stephen continued his theory, building his arguments higher and higher, sailing between his intellectual dangers, trying to prove something, his brilliance, his worth, his right to be taken seriously as an artist even though he had yet to create anything significant. Finally, the discussion wound down. Stephen had performed admirably, had shown his intellectual powers, had entertained and challenged his audience. But he felt empty afterward, as he always did after such performances. What had he really accomplished? He had talked brilliantly about someone else's art, but he still hadn't created his own. He was still living in the shadow of others. Shakespeare, his father, even Buck Mulligan, rather than stepping fully into his own light. As he left the library with Mulligan and the others, walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Stephen felt the familiar weight of his situation. He was talented but unproven, brilliant but unproductive, full of theories but lacking in actual creation. When would he write his own Hamlet? When would he become the artist he dreamed of being rather than just talking about other people's art? The afternoon stretched ahead. Somewhere in Dublin, Bloom continued his wanderings. Somewhere, the hour approached 4 o'clock. And Stephen walked on, still searching, still navigating between the dangers that threatened to destroy him, the siller of losing himself in pew thought and the Charybdis of drowning in the material world, trying to find the narrow passage that would lead him to his true self. The afternoon sun moved across Dublin, and the city breathed with the rhythm of thousands of lives unfolding simultaneously. In this hour, everyone was somewhere, doing something, moving through streets and thoughts, each person the center of their own story, each story intersecting with countless others in ways seen and unseen. This was Dublin at 3 o'clock, a city in motion, a web of parks crossing and recrossing, a symphony of separate melodies playing all at once. Father Conmee, a Jesuit priest, walked through the northern suburbs on a charitable errand. He was going to arrange for the admission of a boy to a school for the sons of those who had served in the military. As he walked, he thought pleasant, pious thoughts, greeted people he passed, and felt satisfied with his role as a spiritual shepherd. He saw the world as orderly, hierarchical, everyone in their proper place under God's watchful eye. Elsewhere in the city, Corny Kelleher stood outside his establishment, an undertaker by trade, arranging funerals, measuring people for their final rest. He chatted with a constable about trivial matters, two men comfortable in their routine interactions, the business of death and law enforcement mixing easily in Dublin's social fabric. One-legged sailor begged on the streets, moving slowly from corner to corner, singing a simple song for pennies. People passed him with varying degrees of attention. Some dropped coins, some averted their eyes, some didn't notice him at all. He was part of the city's landscape, as familiar and overlooked as the buildings themselves. Young Master Dignarm, son of the man buried that morning, walked through the city on an errand for his mother. He was still in his funeral clothes, still feeling the strangeness of his father's death, still trying to understand what it meant to be the man of the house now. He passed shops and strangers, carrying his new responsibility like an ill-fitting coat. Blazes Boylan walked confidently through the streets, a prosperous figure in a fashionable hat. He was on his way, though not yet, not quite yet, to his 4 o'clock appointment with Molly Bloom. He stopped to buy fruit, selecting a basket of ripe peaches and a jar of potted meat, gifts for the woman he was about to visit. His confidence was complete. He moved through the world as though it existed to please him. The blind stripling, the young man Bloom had helped across the street earlier, tapped his way along the pavement with his cane, navigating by memory and sound and touch through a world he couldn't see. He went to his piano tuning work, finding his way through darkness, proving that the city could be known through senses other than sight. Miss Dunn worked in her office, typing letters for a solicitor, her fingers moving mechanically over the keys while her mind wandered to thoughts of romance and possibility. She watched the clock, counting the minutes until she could leave, until her real life, the life outside this office, could resume. Tom Rockford demonstrated his invention to interested onlookers, a device that showed which song was playing in the music hall below. It was clever and mechanical, a small wonder of technology, and the men gathered around it with the enthusiasm people reserve for novelties that promise to make the world more knowable, more controllable. Buck Mulligan and Haynes walked together, planning their evening, speaking of theatre and literature. Mulligan entertained his English friend with wit and mockery, playing the role of the clever Irishman, performing Irish culture for foreign consumption, always aware of his audience. Lenihan and McCoy strolled together, two men with time on their hands and nothing pressing to accomplish. They spoke of horses and bets and women, the ordinary discourse of men who lived on the margins of respectability, neither quite successful nor quite failures, floating through life on charm and luck. Stephen Dedalus browsed in a bookshop, looking at old volumes, his mind still churning with thoughts from his library performance. He handled the books gently, these repositories of other people's thoughts and dreams, wondering when his own words would be banned and sold. And Leopold Bloom walked through the streets, conducting his small errands, observing everything with his characteristic curiosity. He went to a bookseller to negotiate an advertisement. He stopped to look at books displayed in a window, drawn to one titled Sweets of Sin, a mildly pornographic novel that made him think of Molly, of desire, of the afternoon that awaited him. All these separate parts wound through Dublin like threads in a complex weaving. People passed each other without knowing the full stories they carried. The one-legged sailor passed the viceroy's cavalcade, poverty encountering power, neither truly seeing the other. Father Conmee blessed people who didn't notice his blessing. The blind stripling moved through crowds of people who took sight for granted. And at the center of it all, or perhaps scattered throughout it, were small moments of connection and disconnection. A throwaway advertisement floated down the Liffey, the same one Bloom had tossed earlier, sailing past boats and banks toward the sea. It carried the message of a coming religious event, but nobody was reading it now. It was just debris, just one more thing flowing downstream. The viceroy's procession moved through the streets with official dignity. Lord Dudley, representing British authority, rode through his domain while Dubliners watched with varying degrees of respect, resentment, or indifference. Some saluted, some ignored, some made subtle gestures of defiance. Even this official display meant different things to different observers. Master Dignam, still on his errand, passed near where his father had lived and worked and drunk. The geography of the city was marked by memory, nay, by absence, by the ghost of the father he would carry with him always. The hours moved toward 4 o'clock. The city continued its complex dance of intersecting parks, near misses, and occasional collisions. Every person was the protagonist of their own story, yet each was also a minor character in countless other stories, glimpsed briefly in passing, contributing to the texture of the day without knowing their full impact. This was Dublin, not as one unified narrative, but as a multitude of narratives happening simultaneously, each valid, each complete in itself, each intersecting with others in patterns too complex to fully map. Father Conmee reached his destination, satisfied with his charitable work. Boylan moved closer to Eccles Street. Bloom continued his wandering, delaying his return home. Stephen remained lost in his thoughts and ambitions. The one-legged sailor collected his pennies. The blind stripling tuned his pianos. Miss Dunn typed her letters. And somewhere above it all, if one could rise high enough to see the whole city at once, the pattern might become visible. The wandering rocks of Dublin's citizens, each following their own path, each avoiding collision by chance or design, each contributing to the miraculous fact that a city could function at all, that thousands of separate intentions could somehow weave together into the fabric of a day. But from grand level, from within the experience of living it, there was just this moment, this street, this encounter, this thought, this step forward into the continuing afternoon. As 4 o'clock approached, Leopold Bloom found himself at the Ormond Hotel, where music and voices filled the air like waves washing over listeners, beautiful and dangerous at once. He had come here partly on business, partly to delay his return home, partly because he couldn't help himself. He was drawn here just as Odysseus had been drawn toward the singing of the sirens. The bar of the Ormond Hotel was presided over by two barmaids, Miss Douce and Miss Kennedy. They were young and pretty, aware of their effect on the male customers, using their charm as currency in the social economy of the establishment. They laughed and teased, their voices rising and falling like music themselves, drawing men to the bar as surely as sirens drew sailors to the rocks. Miss Douce had bronze hair that caught the light. Miss Kennedy's hair was gold. Together they created a harmony of feminine allure, a duet of practiced flotation that kept the customers ordering drinks and leaving generous tips. Into this musical atmosphere came various men of Dublin. Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, came to sing. He had a fine tenor voice, one of the few gifts he still possessed from his more prosperous days. Ben Dollard came too, and other men who loved music and drink and the fellowship of other men who shared these loves. And Blazes Bolan came, or rather, passed through on his way to Eccles Street, to his appointment with Molly. Bloom, sitting in the dining room adjacent to the bar, saw him arrive, saw him drink a quick glass, heard his confident voice, watched him check the time, and knew where he was going. The knowledge was like a physical pain, a wound that music could soothe but not heal. Bloom sat at his table, pretending to examine a letter, pretending to eat his late lunch, while his mind followed Bolan's journey through the streets toward his house, toward his wife, toward the betrayal he knew was coming but couldn't stop. To distract himself, Bloom listened to the music. Simon Dedalus sang an old Irish ballad called Mapari, a song about lost love and longing. His voice was beautiful still, full of feeling, and the men in the bar fell silent to listen. Even Bloom, in his sorrow, was moved by the beauty of the singing. Music has this power to reach past our defenses, to touch something deeper than thought, to make us feel what we've been trying not to feel. The song spoke of a love that appeared like a vision, brought joy, then vanished, leaving only sorrow behind. It was, Bloom thought, like his own marriage, something beautiful that had appeared, flourished, then somehow faded, leaving him with memories of what had been and awareness of what was now lost. As Simon sang, Bloom's mind wandered through his own history with Molly. He remembered their courtship, their early passion, the intensity of their connection. He remembered the day he had proposed to her on Howth Head, how she had said yes, how the world had seemed full of promise. He remembered their son Rudy, born in hope, dead in 11 days, taking something irreplaceable with him when he died. After Rudy, everything had changed. Molly's warmth had turned elsewhere. Their physical intimacy had ceased. They had become companions who shared a house but no longer shared the deepest parts of themselves. The singing continued. Another man, it was Ben Dollard, sang a song called The Croppy Boy, a tragic ballad about an Irish rebel who confessed his sins to what he thought was a priest, only to discover it was an English officer in disguise. The young rebel was betrayed and hanged, dying for his loyalty to Ireland. The men in the bar listened with patriotic emotion, moved by this tale of betrayal and sacrifice. But Bloom heard it differently. He heard a story about trust misplaced, about how the people we open our hearts to can turn out to be our destroyers. He thought about his own confession, not spoken aloud, but known nonetheless, that his wife was at this moment with another man, that his marriage was a shell, that he was the croppy boy confessing to an enemy disguised as a friend. The clock moved forward. 4 o'clock passed. Bloom knew what was happening at his house on Eccles Street. The knowledge filled him with pain and strange resignation. He couldn't change it. He could only sit here, listening to music, letting the beauty of the singing wash over his sorrow like waves over rocks. Miss Douce and Miss Kennedy laughed and flirted at their bar, unaware of Bloom's suffering or uncaring about it. To them, he was just another customer, middle-aged and unremarkable, no different from the dozen other men in the room. They couldn't see the drama playing out in his mind, the tragedy of his afternoon. Bloom's thoughts turned to writing a response to Martha Clifford, his pen pal correspondent. He would write something flirtatious, something that kept their harmless game alive. It was his own small rebellion, his own betrayal in return, though so much more innocent than what was happening at his home. He began to compose the letter in his mind, finding the words, imagining her reading them. The music continued. Songs of love and loss, of Ireland's sorrows, of longing and betrayal and remembrance. Each song was a siren call, drawing listeners into feeling, into memory, into the dangerous waters of emotion that reason couldn't navigate. Bloom thought about how music could express what words alone couldn't. The mathematics of melody, the physics of vibration and resonance. Simha produced beauty that moved the soul. How did sound waves become meaning? How did rhythm and harmony create emotion? His scientific curiosity engaged even in his pain. As the afternoon wore on, as more songs were sung and more drinks were poured, Bloom sat in his liminal space, present in the Ormond Hotel but absent in his thoughts, hearing the music but lost in his own internal symphony of sorrow and acceptance. The barmaids laughed. The customers drank. The singers performed their art. And Bloom sat, a silent figure at his table, navigating between the rocks of despair and denial, trying to find some path forward through waters that threatened to dash him to pieces. Finally, as the musical session wound down, Bloom prepared to leave. He would walk through Dublin some more, would delay his return home a while longer, would give Molly and Bolin time to complete their betrayal before he walked back into his house and pretended not to know what had happened there. He stood, paid his bill, and stepped out into the street. Behind him, the music continued, the sirens sang on, and other men sat drinking and listening, each carrying their own unspoken sorrows, each finding in music a temporary refuge from the difficulties of living. The afternoon light was golden now, moving toward evening. Bloom walked on, carrying his knowledge, his sorrow, his resilience. The music faded behind him, but its echoes remained, a reminder that beauty exists even in sorrow, that art can touch us even when we're broken, that life continues even when we think we cannot bear it. As the afternoon moved toward evening, Leopold Bloom found himself in Barney Coonan's pub, a dark establishment where Dublin's men gathered to drink and talk, to share stories and grievances, to build themselves up by tearing others down. It was not a place Bloom would normally choose, but he had come on an errand, to meet with Martin Cunningham about arranging help for the Dignam family, the widow and children left behind by that morning's funeral. The pub was presided over in spirit, if not officially, by a man known only as the Citizen, a fierce Irish nationalist who sat in the corner like a cyclops in his cave, seeing the world with one narrow perspective, blind to any complexity or nuance that didn't fit his rigid world-view. The Citizen was a large man, passionate in his hatreds and his loyalties. He loved Ireland with a fierce, exclusive love, the kind that left no room for anyone who didn't fit his definition of true Irish. He hated England with equal fervor, blamed the British for every Irish ill, and saw traitors and collaborators everywhere he looked. The story of this episode was told not by Bloom himself, but by an unnamed narrator, a bitter, sarcastic Dubliner who collected debts for a living and had a cynical view of everything and everyone. He sat in the pub with his friend Joe Hines and others, drinking, talking, passing the time in the way men did in such places. When Bloom entered, the narrator observed him with suspicious eyes. Here was someone different, not quite Irish, not quite anything, really. Bloom was Jewish, though not religiously observant. He was married to a Catholic woman, but he himself had been baptized Protestant. He belonged nowhere completely, and in the nationalist atmosphere of the pub, this made him dangerous, suspect, other. The conversation in the pub ranged across many topics: politics, sports, history, grievances. The men spoke with the confidence of people who knew they were right, who had simple answers to complex questions, who understood the world in clear categories of us and them, friend and enemy, Irish and foreign. The Citizen held forth like a prophet, speaking of ancient Irish glory, of Celtic heroes and Gaelic traditions. He painted a picture of Ireland that was pure and mythical, unsullied by the messy reality of actual Irish history, with all its complications and contradictions. His island was an imagined paradise that had been stolen by the British and would be restored once the traitors and foreigners were expelled. Bloom, waiting for Martin Cunningham, tried to be polite, tried to participate in the conversation without causing offense. But everything about him seemed to irritate the citizen. His politeness, his reasonableness, his refusal to join in the simple hatreds that band the other men together. The conversation turned to executions, to a recent hanging. The men spoke with cruel humor about death, about violence, about punishment. They were desensitized to suffering through their talk, making jokes to distance themselves from the horror of what they discussed. Bloom, uncomfortable with this callousness, spoke up. "But it's no laughing matter," he said quietly. He tried to express some basic human sympathy, some recognition that violence and death were serious things, not material for casual jokes. This mild objection was met with hostility. Who was he to tell them how to speak? What did this outsider know about Irish suffering, Irish struggles, Irish humor? Martin Cunningham finally arrived, and he and Bloom stepped outside briefly to discuss the charity for Mrs. Dignarm. Bloom had been working to arrange this help, using his connections and practical skills to make something actually happen, not just talking about charity, but organizing it. When they returned to the pub, the conversation had turned to other matters. Someone mentioned that Bloom had won money on a horse race, a lucky bet that had paid off. The men's attitude toward him shifted slightly. He had money, again. He was prosperous. Perhaps that explained his airs, his difference. The citizen seized on this, his one eye, metaphorically speaking, focusing on Bloom with renewed suspicion. "And where did you get that money?" his manner seemed to ask. "What schemes and tricks did you use? What advantage did you take?" The topic shifted to what it meant to be Irish, to belong to the nation. The citizen spoke passionately about Irish identity, about blood and soil, about who had the right to call themselves Irish and who were merely pretenders and interlopers. Bloom, pushed to defend himself, tried to articulate a different vision, not of exclusive nationalism based on blood, but of common humanity, of shared values, of universal principles that transcended borders and tribes. "But," he said, trying to find the words, "your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me." This was the wrong thing to say. The room erupted. The citizen roared his outrage. How dare this Jewish interloper claim kinship with Christ? How dare he use religion to defend his alien presence in Ireland? The atmosphere turned dangerous. The citizen's rage was physical now, threatening. His dog, a mangy, ill-tempered creature that matched his master's disposition, growled at Bloom. Other men in the pub, emboldened by the citizens' anger and their own drinks, joined in the hostility. Bloom tried to speak calmly, to reason, to appeal to basic human decency. He spoke of persecution, of how his people had been persecuted for centuries, of how Ireland should understand this better than most nations. He spoke of love, of kindness, of the principles that should unite people rather than divide them. Your God, he said, was a Jew, and his father was a Jew. That's what I'm saying. But reason had no place here. The citizen wanted blood, wanted to strike, wanted to drive out the foreign element that had invaded his territory. He was the Cyclops, and Bloom was the clever Odysseus who had offended him. But unlike in Homer's tale, Bloom had no giant boulder to hide behind, no divine protection. Fortunately, Martin Cunningham intervened. He hurried Bloom out of the pub before violence could erupt, bundling him into a waiting car. As they drove away, the citizen stumbled out of the pub, still raging, and threw something. Accounts differ on what exactly, perhaps a biscuit tin, after the departing vehicle. Bloom escaped, but shaken. He had encountered the dark side of Irish nationalism, the violence that lurked beneath the talk of ancient glories and cultural pride. He had seen how quickly fellowship could turn to hostility, how easily difference could become excuse for violence. As the car carried him away from Barney Cunnan's pub, Bloom felt the weight of his perpetual outsider status. He was too Jewish for the Irish, too Irish for the Jews, too rational for the dreamers, too dreamy for the rationalists. He fit nowhere completely, belonged nowhere entirely. Yet there was also something liberating in this position. Because he wasn't bound by the rigid categories that trapped others, he could see beyond them. Because he didn't share the citizen's one-eyed vision, he could perceive complexities and contradictions that the nationalist couldn't or wouldn't see. Bloom thought about what he had tried to say in the pub, that love and understanding should transcend boundaries of nation and race and religion. He believed this, even if he couldn't articulate it well, even if others mocked him for it. He believed in a kind of universal humanity that made all people brothers and sisters, regardless of what tribe they claimed or what god they worshipped. This wasn't a popular position, especially in a Dublin that was stirring with nationalist fervour, that was defining itself through opposition to Britain, that was drawing ever sharper lines between who belonged and who didn't. But Bloom held to it anyway, stubbornly, quietly, without fanfare self-righteousness. The encounter had frightened him, certainly. The citizen's rage had been real and dangerous. But Bloom had survived, had escaped the Cyclops's cave, if just barely. He would continue his wandering through Dublin, would continue his patient endurance of the world's hostility and misunderstanding. Evening was approaching now. The day that had begun at the Martello Tower with Buck Mulligan's mock mass, that had proceeded through funerals and newspaper offices, through libraries and streets and pubs, was moving toward its conclusion. Bloom had hours yet to fill before he would return home to face whatever awaited him there. The evidence of Molly's betrayal, the emptiness of his marriage bed, the long night ahead. But he had survived this encounter. He had stood up for his beliefs, however poorly articulated. He had maintained his dignity in the face of mockery and threat. He had shown a kind of courage, not the heroic courage of warriors and revolutionaries, but the quieter courage of someone who refuses to become bitter, who continues to believe in goodness despite endless evidence to the contrary. The car moved through Dublin's streets as the light began to soften toward evening. Somewhere behind him, the citizen still raged in his pub, still saw the world with his single, narrow vision. But Bloom looked forward, looked around, looked at the complicated, beautiful, frustrating world with both eyes open, seeing its flaws but also its possibilities, its cruelties but also its kindness, its divisions but also its potential for unity. After the violence and anger of Barney Kennan's pub, Leopold Bloom found himself at Sandemount Strand, the same beach where Stephen had walked that morning, though the two men never quite met there. The evening was gathering softly, the sun descending toward the horizon, painting the sky with gentle colors as the day prepared to surrender to night. Bloom sat on a rock, exhausted by his day of wandering, by the funeral and the confrontations, by the knowledge of Molly's betrayal, by the weight of being always on the outside looking in. He needed rest, needed quiet, needed to simply sit and let the rhythm of the waves soothe his troubled mind. On the beach nearby, 3 young women were minding children, Sissy Caffrey and Eddie Boardman, energetic and lively, and Gertie McDowell, who sat slightly apart, lost in her own romantic daydreams. Gertie was a young woman who lived largely in the world of romance novels and advertisements, imagining herself as a heroine from the sentimental stories she read. She was pretty in a conventional way, careful about her appearance, dreaming of the right man who would recognize her worth and sweep her into the kind of love she had read about in magazines. She noticed Bloom sitting on his rock, this dark, mysterious stranger, this man who seemed wounded and lonely. And in her romantic imagination, she began to weave a story about him, about who he might be, what sorrows he carried, whether he might be the kind of sensitive soul who would appreciate a girl like her. The sun moved lower. The church nearby held evening devotions to the Virgin Mary, and the sound of the service drifted across the beach, hymns and prayers mixing with the sound of waves, creating a dreamlike atmosphere where the sacred and the earthly merged. Gertie became aware that Bloom was watching her, and in the strange, unspoken communication that can happen between strangers, she began to perform for him. She leaned back on the rock where she sat, adjusted her position in ways that revealed more of her form. When the children launched a firework that lit up the darkening sky, she leaned back further, knowing he was watching, knowing what he could see, participating in this silent exchange of desire. Bloom watched, grateful and guilty at once. He had been rejected by the men at the pub, had been made to feel alien and unwanted. Now this young woman offered him something, not love, not connection exactly, but at least recognition, at least the acknowledgement that he was a man worthy of desire, that he existed in someone else's awareness. It was a moment of mutual fantasy. Gertie imagined him as a romantic figure, mysterious and sensitive. Bloom fanned in her a kind of innocent beauty that contrasted with his knowledge of Molly's sophisticated betrayal. Neither knew the other's reality. She didn't know about his wounded marriage, his day of wandering, his patient endurance of life's disappointments. He didn't know that she was lame, that she walked with a limp she carefully concealed, that her romantic dreams were compensation for the limitations of her actual life. The fireworks continued, bursting in the darkening sky with brief moments of glory before fading. They were like so many things, beautiful and temporary, promising more than they delivered, gone almost as soon as they appeared. When Gertie finally stood and walked away with her friends, Bloom saw her limp and felt a wave of tenderness mixed with his earlier desire. She was wounded too, in her way. They were both damaged people, finding a moment of connection through fantasy and distance, giving each other something they needed without the complications of actual intimacy. Bloom remained on the beach as darkness settled fully. He thought about desire, about loneliness, about the various ways people sought connection and comfort. He thought about Molly at home, about Bolin who had visited her that afternoon, about his own small betrayals and fantasies, about Martha Clifford's letters, about this girl on the beach. He felt tired, so tired. The day had been long and difficult. He had walked miles through Dublin, had attended a funeral, had faced hostility and rejection, had carried the knowledge of his wife's infidelity, had survived threats of violence. Now, as evening embraced the beach, He simply wanted to rest. The strand was peaceful in the gathering darkness. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, caring nothing for human dramas, simply being themselves, moving in and out, like breath, like life itself, continuing regardless of individual sorrows and joys. Bloom thought about writing to Gertie, perhaps, leaving a message in the sand for her to find. But the tide would wash it away, just as it washed away everything. What was the point of leaving messages that would disappear? He dozed slightly, sitting there on his rock, letting the day's exhaustion catch up with him. In his half-sleep, thoughts drifted through his mind like the clouds across the evening sky. Memories, observations, plans, regrets, acceptances. Everything mixed together in the peaceful confusion of the edge of sleep. When he finally rose to leave the beach, the stars were emerging overhead. The same stars that had witnessed Stephen's morning walk on this strand, that had seen all the day's dramas and disappointments, that would continue shining long after everyone now living had joined the dead in Glasnevin Cemetery. Bloom walked slowly away from the strand, back toward the city, back toward his life. He still had hours to fill before he would return home to his empty marriage bed. But something about the evening on the beach had given him a kind of peace, had reminded him that beauty existed even in limitation, that connection was possible even through fantasy, that he was still capable of desire and still worthy of being desired, however briefly, however imperfectly. The episode ended as the sun had, gently, with colors fading, with soft darkness embracing everything, with the promise of rest after the day's long journey. As evening deepened into night, Leopold Bloom made his way to the National Maternity Hospital on Holles Street. He had been thinking throughout the day about Mrs. Pufoy, a woman he knew who had been in labor for 3 days now, struggling to bring a child into the world. His compassionate nature drew him to inquire after her, to see if there was any news, to offer whatever comfort his presence might provide. The hospital was a place of birth and becoming, of life emerging from darkness into light, of the eternal process of generation continuing despite pain and danger. It was also, at this particular evening hour, a gathering place for medical students and young men who sat drinking and talking while upstairs women labored and children were born. In a common room, Bloom found a group of young men engaged in loud conversation, medical students like Dixon and Lenihan, and among them, to Bloom's surprise, Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan. They had been drinking, their conversation growing wilder and more blasphemous as the evening wore on. The young men spoke of many things, of birth and death, of fertility and sterility, of the mysteries of generation and the comic absurdities of sexual reproduction. They joked about conception, made crude remarks about women, debated whether it was moral to prevent pregnancy or whether every act of love should aim toward creating life. Stephen, drunk now, participated in the discussion with his characteristic intensity, though his words came out more chaotic than usual. He spoke of theological mysteries, of the relationship between spirit and flesh, of birth and creation and the artist as a kind of divine generator bringing new forms into being. Bloom listened to these young men with a mixture of sympathy and concern. They were cowless in their talk, treating sacred matters as material for jokes, speaking of birth as if it were an abstract concept rather than a real process involving real suffering. They had the thoughtless cruelty of the young, who haven't yet learned how fragile life is, how much pain accompanies its continuation. He thought about Mrs. Pufoy upstairs, laboring for 3 days to bring forth life. He thought about his own Molly, who had given birth to Millie and to poor dead Rudy. He thought about the courage of women, the terrible physical price they paid for the continuation of the species, the pain that men could never fully understand because they never had to endure it. The conversation among the young men continued, growing more raucous. They debated philosophical questions about birth and existence, about whether it was better to be born not to be born, about the ethics of bringing children into a world of suffering. But their debate was all theoretical, all abstract. They had no real understanding of what they were talking about. Mulligan, as always, made jokes, turning everything into comedy. He mocked religious attitudes toward birth, mocked the idea of sin, mocked conventional morality. Stephen laughed at his friend's irreverence, though there was something hollow in his laughter, something that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with this cowless blasphemy. Then, finally, there was movement in the hospital. A nurse appeared with news. Mrs. Pufoy had given birth. After 3 days of labor, the child had finally come. Both mother and baby were alive, weak but alive. The sacred mystery had completed itself once more. Life had emerged from life. The young men cheered, but more at the excuse to drink another toast than from genuine feeling about the birth. But Bloom felt something deeper, relief for Mrs. Pufoy, gratitude that she had survived, wonder at the miracle of new life, sorrow for all the difficulties that lay ahead for both mother and child. He thought about beginnings, how every person begins in darkness and pain, how we are all born through our mother's suffering, how we enter the world helpless and vulnerable. And he thought about language itself, about how it too is born, how it develops from simple cries to complex expression, how each person must learn it anew, recapitulating in their own development the entire history of human speech. The young men, energized by drink and by the news of the birth, decided to leave the hospital and continue their celebration elsewhere. Stephen went with them, drawn along by Mulligan's energy and his own drunken momentum, though part of him seemed to resist, to want something different from this cowless carousing. Bloom followed, worried about Stephen. He had been watching the young man throughout the evening, had seen his brilliance and his vulnerability, had recognized in him something worth protecting. Stephen reminded Bloom of his own lost son. Not Rudy exactly, but the son Rudy might have become if he had lived. A young man of intelligence and sensitivity making his way through a world that didn't always understand or value such qualities. The group spilled out into the night streets, heading toward Burke's pub for more drinking. They talked and laughed and stumbled. These young men full of vitality and thoughtlessness, burning through their youth like candles in the wind. Bloom walked with them but apart from them, maintaining a certain distance, watching Stephen especially. He felt a protective instinct toward this young man who seemed so lost despite his brilliance, so vulnerable despite his intellectual armor. The night had fully fallen now. June 16, 1904, was moving toward its final hours. The day that had begun with mourning at the Martello Tower, that had proceeded through funeral and newspaper office, through library and streets and pubs and beach, was approaching its conclusion. Bloom had witnessed a birth this evening, not directly, but by being present in the place where life emerged from darkness. It was a reminder that despite all the death and betrayal and disappointment of the day, life continued. Children were still being born. The future was still coming into being, generation after generation, each person beginning their own journey through suffering and joy, each adding their own voice to the great human conversation. The young men headed toward more drinking, more noise, more careless spending of the energy and time they thought would last forever. And Bloom walked with them, the older man watching over the younger, carrying in his heart a father's protective instinct even though Stephen was not his son, would never be his son, was merely a stranger he had encountered on this long June day. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps this watchful presence, this quiet care, this patient following, perhaps this too was a kind of generation, a kind of birth, a way of bringing something new into being through attention and compassion. The night embraced them all, the newborn child at the hospital, Mrs. Pufoy exhausted from her labor, the young men drunk with wine and youth, Stephen lost in his maze of brilliance and confusion, and Bloom, patient and watchful, continuing his odyssey through Dublin's dark streets. The night deepened, and the group of young men, with Leopold Bloom following at a distance, found themselves in Nighttown, Dublin's red light district, where the respectable city gave way to something darker and more chaotic. This was the realm of Bella Cohen's brothel, where desire and desperation mingled, where the usual rules of society were suspended, where the hidden parts of human nature emerged into the gaslit shadows. Stephen Dedalus, very drunk now, stumbled through the streets with his companions. The evening's drinking had loosened the careful controls he usually maintained over his thoughts and feelings. His mind was fragmenting, reality and fantasy beginning to blur together in ways that would have troubled him if he were sober enough to notice. Bloom followed, worried about this young man who reminded him so much of the son he had lost. He had already intervened once, paying Stephen's pub bill when the younger man was too drunk to manage. Now he felt compelled to continue watching over him, to make sure he didn't come to harm in these dangerous streets. Nighttown was alive with activity, prostitutes calling from doorways, drunken men stumbling between establishments, music and laughter spilling from open windows, the whole dark carnival of human appetite on display. It was a place where transformations happened, where people became other than what they were by day, where the respectable merchant became the willing fool, where the prim clerk became the eager customer of forbidden pleasures. As they entered Bella Cohen's establishment, reality began to shift in strange ways. Or perhaps it was always this way in Nighttown, where the boundary between what was real and what was imagined grew thin and permeable. The ordinary laws that governed daytime Dublin seemed not to apply here. Time moved differently. Identities became fluid. The dead could speak. The impossible could happen. Stephen found himself in a parlor with prostitutes and mirrors, with piano music and the smell of perfume and alcohol. His mind, loosened by drink and exhaustion, began to generate visions. His dead mother appeared to him, not as a comforting presence, but as an accusing ghost, her body still marked by the cancer that had killed her, her voice demanding the prowess he had refused to give. "Pray for me, Stephen," the ghost pleaded. "Pray for your mother's soul." But Stephen, even in his drunken state, could not pretend to a faith he didn't possess. He had refused to pray at her deathbed, and he refused now, even to her ghost. "No!" he cried out, raising his walking stick like a weapon against the vision. "I will not serve." He struck at the chandelier with his ashplant, shattering the light, creating chaos in the brothel. Glass fell like rain, and the prostitutes screamed. Stephen's inner turmoil had manifested in physical destruction. his rebellion against his mother's ghost and against the Catholic Church she represented breaking something real and solid in the external world. Meanwhile, Bloom experienced his own transformations and visions in this strange place. The buried parts of his psyche rose to the surface, taking form as hallucinations that were both ridiculous and revealing. He saw himself accused of various crimes, of being a voyeur, a pervert, a fraud. He was put on trial by phantoms, cross-examined about his secret desires and hidden shames. In one vision, he became a woman, experiencing the world from the other side of the gender divide. In another, he was crowned Lord Mayor of Dublin, feted and celebrated by the masses. Then he was condemned as a traitor, sentenced to death by those same crowds. He was everything and nothing, powerful and powerless, transforming moment by moment in the distorted mirrors of Night Town. Bella Cohen herself appeared, the madam of the brothel, a large woman with both masculine and feminine qualities, dominating and seductive at once. In Bloom's intoxicated perception, she became Bello, a masculine figure who humiliated him, who forced him to acknowledge his secret masochistic desires, who made him confront the parts of himself he usually kept hidden. This Bella figure represented something powerful, the dominance he sometimes craved, the surrender of self that both frightened and attracted him. He made Bloom kneel, made him confess his desires, made him acknowledge that beneath his respectable exterior lived a man with complicated, contradictory needs. But these were visions, hallucinations generated by exhaustion and alcohol and the strange atmosphere of Night Town. Or were they? Perhaps they were simply truths that the normal world didn't allow to be spoken, realities that could only emerge in places like this, where the usual masks could slip. Through all these transformations, Bloom's concern for Stephen never wavered. Even as he experienced his own nightmarish visions, part of him remained alert to the young man's welfare. When Stephen's friends abandoned him, when he was left vulnerable and alone, Bloom stayed. Stephen's hallucinations grew more intense. His mother's ghost loomed over him, growing larger and more terrible, demanding submission, demanding that he acknowledge his guilt, demanding that he return to the faith he had rejected. She represented everything he was trying to escape: Ireland's suffocating Catholicism, the weight of family obligation, the claim the past made on the present. "You killed me, Stephen," the ghost accused. "You killed your own mother by refusing to pray." And Stephen, tormented beyond endurance, struck out with his walking stick, shouting his defiance, "Nothing, nothing, I will not serve." The cry was James Joyce's own battle cry, borrowed from Lucifer's rebellion, non serviam, the ultimate refusal of authority, divine or otherwise. In the chaos that followed, Stephen stumbled out into the street, still pursued by his visions, still fighting his inner demons. Bloom followed, stepping over the broken glass, apologizing to Bella for the damage, paying for the broken chandelier as he had paid for Stephen's drinks earlier, taking responsibility for this young man who seemed determined to destroy himself. Outside in the dark street, Stephen encountered two British soldiers. In his drunken, agitated state, he said something that offended them, perhaps something political, perhaps just the incoherent ravings of a drunk. One of the soldiers struck him, and Stephen fell to the ground, knocked unconscious. Bloom arrived just in time to see Stephen fall. He knelt beside the young man's body, protecting him from further harm, checking that he was still breathing. The soldiers moved on, uninterested in what they'd done, and a small crowd gathered to watch this drama of the Dublin night. As Bloom knelt there, Stephen lying unconscious before him, he experienced a final vision, the most powerful and poignant of all. He saw his son Rudy as he would have been if he had lived, an 11-year-old boy dressed in Eton suit, holding a book, looking at Bloom with silent, reproachful eyes. This was the ghost that truly haunted Bloom, not an accusing spectre like Stephen's mother, but a gentle presence representing everything lost, all the might-have-beens, all the future that had died with his infant son. Rudy stood there in Bloom's vision, real and unreal at once, the boy who would never grow up, the son who would never be. The vision faded, and Bloom was left with the actual Stephen, unconscious but alive, vulnerable but breathing, not his son but perhaps, for this night at least, someone he could care for, someone he could protect, someone who needed him. Bloom took charge of the situation with his characteristic practicality. He dispersed the crowd, checked Stephen's injuries, retrieved his fallen glasses. He found Stephen's lost money. The young man had been carrying his month's pay and would have been robbed if Bloom hadn't been there to protect it. As Stephen began to regain consciousness, muttering confused words about death and his mother, Bloom spoke to him gently, reassuringly, like a father to a son. He helped Stephen sit up, made sure he was coherent enough to stand, offered him a place to recover. "You'd better come home with me," Bloom said quietly. "Just for tonight. Until you feeling better." It was a simple offer, but it carried weight. Bloom was extending care to this stranger, this young man he had been following and protecting all evening, offering him sanctuary, offering him what he needed. Not judgment, not lectures, just a safe place to rest and recover. Stephen, still dazed, didn't fully understand what was being offered. But some part of him recognized the kindness, recognized that this middle-aged man who had appeared in the library that afternoon, who had followed him through the evening, who had protected him from soldiers and thieves, was offering something genuine, a kind of paternal care that Stephen's own father had never really provided. The night had transformed both men. Stephen had confronted his mother's ghost and his own guilt, had enacted his rebellion against authority and paid for it with a blow to the head. Bloom had faced his own hidden desires and shames, had seen them reflected back in the distorted mirrors of Nighttown, and had emerged still capable of compassion, still willing to care for someone else despite his own wounds. As they prepared to leave Nighttown, walking back toward the respectable world, the episode's wild hallucinations began to fade. Reality reasserted itself, or at least, the agreed-upon version of reality that Dublin maintained during daylight hours. The visions receded. The transformations reversed. The impossible things that had seemed so real in Bella Cohen's brothel became merely memories, whether real or imagined no longer quite clear. But something had changed. Some truth had been revealed. Some connection had been made. Bloom and Stephen, the older man and the younger, the practical Jew and the intellectual Catholic, the patient wanderer and the rebellious artist, they had found each other in the depths of the night, in the darkest part of Dublin, in the place where pretense fell away and people became most nakedly themselves. Bloom looked at Stephen with tender concern, seeing not just this particular young man but all young men, all sons, all the vulnerability of youth facing a world that could be so harsh. And Stephen, in his confusion and pain, allowed himself to be cared for, allowed this stranger to guide him, to protect him, to offer him shelter. They walked together through the dark streets, leaving Nighttown behind, heading back toward the center of Dublin. The night was very late now, moving toward morning. June 16th, 1904, was almost over, this day that had seemed to last forever, that had contained so much, funeral and betrayal, anger and desire, visions and reality, all woven together into the fabric of one long Dublin day. Behind them, Nighttown continued its business. The prostitutes called to new customers. The brothels stayed lit. The transformations continued for others as they had for Bloom and Stephen. But for these two men, the journey through that dark realm was complete. They had descended into the underworld, had faced their demons and their desires, and had emerged, changed perhaps, wounded perhaps, but still walking, still moving forward, still capable of connection and care. Bloom continued his protective vigilance, making sure Stephen was steady on his feet, guiding him away from danger, leading him toward shelter and safety. And Stephen, following this unexpected guardian, allowed himself to be led, too exhausted and battered to resist, perhaps grateful even if he couldn't quite articulate it, to have found someone who cared enough to stay. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human dramas, simply being themselves as they had been for billions of years and would be for billions more. But down below, in the streets of Dublin, two men walked together, an unlikely pair, connected by the strange currents of this long day, by circumstance and compassion, by the mysterious ways that people find each other in the darkness. Somewhere ahead lay Bloom's house on Eccles Street, where Molly slept or didn't sleep, where the evidence of Boylan's visit waited, where the reality of Bloom's marriage would have to be faced. But that could wait a little longer. For now, there was just this walk through the night, this companionship of two souls who had both been lost and had somehow, improbably, found each other. The episode ended as dawn approached, the darkness beginning to thin at the edges, the promise of morning light just starting to gather in the east. The longest episode of this long day was over. The hallucinations had faded. The transformations had run their course. And two men walked on through Dublin's streets, heading toward whatever the remainder of the night and the coming morning would bring. After the wild hallucinations and chaos of Nighttown, after the visions and violence and confrontations, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus walked together through the quiet streets of Dublin in the very late hours of the night. They were both exhausted, Stephen from his drinking and his blow to the head, Bloom from his long day of wandering and worry. The city around them was mostly asleep, peaceful in a way it never was during daylight hours. Bloom guided Stephen toward a cabman's shelter near the waterfront, a modest establishment where night workers and late wanderers could get coffee and something to eat. It was a humble place, nothing elegant, but it offered warmth and rest, and that was what both men needed. The shelter was presided over by a man who claimed to be Skinthegoat Fitzharris, a legendary figure from Irish political history, though whether he was truly that person merely someone who enjoyed the borrowed prestige of the name was unclear. He served coffee and bread to the few customers who sat in the dim light, speaking occasionally but mostly leaving people to their own thoughts. Bloom and Stephen sat together, and for the first time that day, they had a real conversation, not the library's intellectual performance, not the confusion of Nighttown, but an actual exchange between two tired men trying to connect across the gulf of their different ages and experiences. Bloom worried about Stephen. The young man looked pale and shaken, still suffering from the blow he'd received. Bloom urged him to drink the coffee, to eat something, to recover his strength. He spoke to Stephen with the care of a concerned father, though he tried not to be too obvious about it, tried not to make the younger man uncomfortable with his solicitude. Stephen, for his part, was gradually becoming more aware of who Bloom was, not just the man who had appeared in the library that afternoon, but someone who had followed him, protected him, paid his debts, saved him from robbery and worse. He felt a confused gratitude mixed with his natural suspicion of human motives. Why was this man being so kind to him? What did he want? But Bloom seemed to want nothing except to help. He spoke of practical matters, where Stephen might find better employment than his current teaching position, how he might develop his artistic talents, whether he had plans for the future. It was the kind of conversation a father might have with a son, gently probing, offering suggestions without demanding, showing interest without imposing. The conversation rambled, as conversations do between tired people late at night. They spoke of many things, of music, of travel, of Dublin's characters and problems, of their respective fathers and their complicated relationships with them. Neither spoke completely openly, neither revealed everything they felt, but they communicated nonetheless, finding points of connection despite their differences. A sailor at another table told elaborate stories about his travels, tales that were probably exaggerated or entirely invented, stories of far-off places and unlikely adventures. Bloom and Stephen listened with varying degrees of belief, but the stories served their purpose. They filled the time. They provided something to focus on besides their own troubled thoughts. Bloom showed Stephen a photograph that had fallen from his pocket earlier, a picture of Molly, though he didn't identify her as his wife. Stephen looked at it politely but without much interest. He was too exhausted, too absorbed in his own problems to really engage with Bloom's life or concerns. They discussed the question of what Stephen should do next. He couldn't return to the Motello Tower. He had given up that space when he surrendered the key to Mulligan. His father's house was not an option. That relationship was too broken, too painful. He had nowhere to go, really, no clear path forward. Bloom, in his indirect way, suggested that Stephen might come home with him, might stay the night at least, might rest and recover before making decisions about his future. It was a generous offer, though Bloom couched it in practical terms. Stephen needed a place to stay. Bloom had a spare room. It was a simple matter of hospitality, nothing more. But it was more, of course. Bloom was lonely in his marriage, isolated in his community, without a son to care for, and Stephen was adrift, wounded, in need of exactly the kind of steady, patient care that Bloom was offering. They needed each other, though neither would say so directly. As they talked, Bloom began to imagine possibilities. Perhaps Stephen could stay with them for a while, could become part of the household. Perhaps he could give Italian lessons to Molly. Stephen spoke Italian. Molly wanted to improve hers for her singing career. Perhaps they could help each other, create some kind of connection that would benefit all three of them. It was a fantasy, really, a middle-aged man's dream of rescuing a young artist, of filling the empty space his son had left, of bringing some vitality and purpose back into his stale marriage. But it was a gentle fantasy, without malice or manipulation, just a tired man imagining how his life might be different, might be better. Stephen listened to Bloom's suggestions without committing to anything. He was grateful for the coffee and the kindness, but he maintained his emotional distance. He was not looking for a father figure, not seeking to be rescued. He had his own path to find, his own art to create, his own life to live. Yet something was forming between them nonetheless. Not quite friendship, not quite a father-son bond, but some connection that transcended their surface differences. They were both outsiders in Dublin, both wounded by life in different ways, both searching for something they couldn't quite name. The conversation continued in its meandering way, circling around topics without quite landing on them, touching on deep matters without fully exploring them. This was how men often communicated, indirectly, through stories and suggestions, through what was implied rather than stated. Bloom spoke of his own experiences, his travels as a young man, his work in advertising, his knowledge of Dublin's streets and characters. He tried to present himself as someone worldly and capable, someone whose advice was worth taking. But beneath his words, Stephen could sense something else: loneliness, disappointment, the weight of a life that hadn't turned out quite as hoped. And Bloom, listening to Stephen's responses, his educated speech and his literary references, his proud refusal of easy solutions, sensed the young man's own struggles, his poverty and isolation, his artistic ambitions and his debts, his need for independence warring with his need for connection. The night outside grew later, moving toward that strange hour between midnight and dawn when the world seems suspended, waiting for morning to redefine it. In the cabman's shelter, time felt suspended too, as if this conversation could continue indefinitely, as if morning might never come to demand decisions and actions. But eventually, they had to leave. The coffee was finished, the bread eaten, the sailors' stories told. Bloom paid the bill, and they stepped back out into the street, into the cool night air that carried the smell of the nearby sea. "Come with me," Bloom said quietly, not quite looking at Stephen, trying to make it sound casual. "You can rest at my house. Decide what to do tomorrow when you're feeling better." Stephen hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain his independence, to walk off into the night alone as he had so many times before. But he was tired, so tired, and his head still ached from the blow, and this man had been kind to him when no one else had. "All right," he said finally, "for tonight." And so they walked together toward Eccles Street, toward Bloom's house where Molly slept, toward whatever the remainder of this night would bring. They walked in companionable silence mostly, two men who had found each other on this long June day, who had formed some kind of bond however tentative, who were trying in their different ways to care for each other without quite admitting that was what they were doing. The streets were empty and peaceful. The stars overhead were fading as the first hint of dawn approached. June 16th, 1904, was nearly over. This day that had contained so much, that had transformed both of them in ways they were still discovering. As they walked, Bloom felt a quiet satisfaction. He had helped someone, had protected someone, had offered shelter to someone who needed it. It wasn't much, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it was something real, something good, something that mattered. And Stephen, walking beside this unusual man who had appeared in his life like a character from a story, felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel, a sense of being cared for, of not being entirely alone, of having found, however temporarily, someone who wanted nothing from him except his well-being. Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus arrived at 7 Eccles Street in the very early hours of the morning, as June 16, 1904, finally gave way to June 17. The house stood quietly in the darkness, its windows showing no light, its occupant presumably asleep within. Bloom reached for his key and discovered something both expected and disappointing. He had forgotten it that morning. In the rush of preparing breakfast for Molly, in the distraction of beginning his day, he had left the house without his latchkey. Now, in the middle of the night, he stood locked out of his own home. But Bloom was nothing if not resourceful. He was a practical man who could solve practical problems. He led Stephen around to the back of the house, to the area beneath the dining room window. With some effort and undignified maneuvering, Bloom climbed through, dropped into his own kitchen, and then went to open the front door for Stephen from inside. They entered together into the dark house. Bloom lit a candle, and by its small flame they navigated to the kitchen. Everything in the house was quiet. Molly was asleep upstairs, unaware of their arrival. The silence was both peaceful and heavy with the day's accumulated meanings. In the kitchen, Bloom set about the simple ritual of making cocoa. He filled the kettle, lit the gas, measured out the chocolate powder. These were ordinary actions, performed countless times before, but tonight they carried special significance. He was preparing cocoa for a guest, for someone he had brought home, for Stephen who sat at his kitchen table waiting. As the water heated, Bloom looked around his kitchen with fresh eyes. Here were the traces of his day, the breakfast dishes he had used that morning, evidence of the life he lived in this house. But here too were other traces, signs of what had happened in his absence. On the mantelpiece, he noticed something slightly out of place, evidence that someone else had been here, that Bolin had visited as planned, that what Bloom knew would happen had indeed happened. A chair was not quite where it usually stood. Small things, subtle signs, but Bloom noticed them all. He did not rage or weep. He had known all day what was happening, had carried that knowledge through funeral and pub, through beach and brothel, through all his wanderings. Now, confronted with the physical evidence, he simply acknowledged it with his characteristic resignation. This was his life. This was what it had become. The water boiled, and Bloom prepared 2 cups of cocoa. He and Stephen sat together in the quiet kitchen, drinking the warm beverage, 2 men at the end of a long day, finding comfort in this simple domestic ritual. They talked about various matters: music, languages, literature. Bloom suggested again that Stephen might give Italian lessons to Molly. He sketched out a plan whereby Stephen could stay with them, could become part of their household, could contribute through teaching while also having time for his own writing. It was a vision of possible domesticity, the 3 of them living together in this house, creating some new kind of family unit. Molly would have her Italian lessons and perhaps some intellectual companionship. Stephen would have shelter and time to write. And Bloom would have both a surrogate son and someone to help bridge the gap between him and his wife. But even as he outlined this vision, Bloom must have known it was unlikely to happen. Stephen was too independent, too determined to make his own way, too suspicious of comfortable arrangements that might compromise his artistic integrity. And Molly, well, Molly had her own life, her own desires, her own plans that didn't necessarily include an impoverished young scholar living in their spare room. Stephen listened politely but noncommittally. He was grateful for Bloom's kindness, but he was not looking to be adopted, not seeking a substitute father, not ready to settle into domestic arrangements. He had his own path to forge, however difficult and uncertain. As they finished their cocoa, the conversation wound down naturally. It was very late, or very early, depending on how one looked at it. Stephen needed to leave, to find whatever sleeping arrangement he would find, to continue his own journey. And Bloom needed to go upstairs, to face his marriage bed, to sleep beside his wife after this long day of knowledge and wondering. They went to the front door together. Bloom opened it, and they stood for a moment on the threshold, looking out at the night sky. The stars were visible, countless points of light in the vast darkness. Bloom, with his scientific curiosity, thought about those stars, their distance, and yet individual concerns were what mattered, weren't they? The vast universe continued its impersonal movements regardless of human joy or sorrow. But here on earth, in this small house on this Dublin street, people lived and loved and suffered, and that was the only reality that truly touched them. Stephen and Bloom stood together under those stars, two men who had shared this day, who had formed some connection however tentative. They shook hands, a formal gesture, a masculine goodbye, but also an acknowledgement of something genuine between them. "Thank you," Stephen said simply, "for everything." Bloom nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and think about the Italian lessons. The offer stands." But both knew that Stephen would not return, that this was goodbye, that their paths had crossed for this one day and would likely not cross again in any meaningful way. Stephen would continue his struggle to become an artist, and Bloom would continue his patient endurance of his life's disappointments. Stephen walked away into the darkness, and Bloom watched him go, watched his surrogate son disappear into the night, leaving him once again without the young man he had hoped to help and protect. Bloom closed the door and turned back to his house, to his life. He extinguished the candle he had been carrying and made his way upstairs in darkness, guided by long familiarity with his own home. At the bedroom door, he paused. Inside, Molly slept in their bed, the bed where she had received Bolin that afternoon, the bed where Bloom would now lie beside her. What did he feel? Anger? Sorrow? Acceptance? Perhaps all of these, perhaps none, perhaps something too complex for simple naming. He undressed quietly, not wanting to wake her. He noted with his characteristic attention to detail all the small signs of the day, the bed slightly different from how he had left it, the lingering scent of Bolin's perfume, the warmth of the sheets that someone else had recently occupied. Bloom climbed into bed carefully, fitting himself into the space available, curling into a fetal position. He lay there thinking about his day, about the funeral, about the confrontation at the pub, about Stephen, about everything that had happened in these long hours. He thought about Molly beside him, her body warm with sleep. He thought about their history together, the love they had shared, the son they had lost, the gradual erosion of their intimacy. He thought about Boylan and about his own inadequacies as a husband, and about whether things could have been different. But mostly, he felt a kind of calm acceptance. This was his life. This was what it was. He could not change Molly's choices or his own past failures. He could only continue forward, continue enduring, continue finding small pleasures and meanings where he could. He thought about Stephen walking somewhere in the Dublin night, carrying his own burdens, fighting his own battles. He thought about all the people sleeping in Dublin, the Dignams mourning their father, little Milly in Mullingar, the men from the pub, the prostitutes of Nighttown, everyone with their own private struggles and small triumphs. And he thought about the universe beyond, those stars he and Stephen had looked at, the vast spaces between them, the eternal movements of celestial bodies following their mathematical patterns with perfect indifference to human concerns. What did it all mean? Was there meaning in any of it? Bloom didn't know. He was not a philosopher like Stephen, not someone who needed grand theories to make sense of existence. He was simply a man living his life, doing his best, enduring what needed to be endured, finding joy where he could find it. In the question and answer format that his tired mind naturally fell into, Bloom reviewed his day. Where had he been? Everywhere in Dublin. Funeral, office, library, pub, beach, hospital, brothel, shelter, home. What had he done? He had conducted his business, helped where he could, protected Stephen, endured humiliation, witnessed birth, escaped violence, returned home. What had he learned? Nothing he hadn't known before, perhaps. Only that life continues, that people survive disappointments, that small kindnesses matter even when grand gestures are impossible. What did he want? Peace, rest, acceptance. To sleep beside his wife despite everything. To wake tomorrow and continue living, because what else was there to do? And so Leopold Bloom, ordinary citizen of Dublin, advertisement canvasser, husband to Molly, father to lost Rudy and living Milly, protector of Stephen for one day, wanderer through his own city transformed into Odyssey, Leopold Bloom finally rested. He closed his eyes. The day that had contained eternity was over. June 16th, 1904, had ended. Tomorrow would be June 17th, and it would bring new challenges and small pleasures, and he would face them as he faced everything, with patience, with observation, with his particular mixture of sadness and resilience. The house settled around him. Molly breathed beside him in sleep. The stars continued their movements overhead. The universe continued its expansion, indifferent but somehow also comforting in its vastness and impersonality. And Bloom, having completed his Odyssey, having returned to his Ithaca, having faced what needed to be faced, finally surrendered to sleep. In the darkness of the bedroom, as Leopold Bloom settled into sleep beside her, Molly Bloom lay awake with her thoughts flowing like an endless river. She had been half awake when he climbed into bed, aware of his return but not fully roused from her drowsy state. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, her mind wandered through memories and sensations, desires and observations, all flowing together without punctuation or pause, one thought leading to another in the natural rhythm of consciousness at rest. She thought about the afternoon, about Blazes Borland's visit. Yes, it had happened as she had planned, as Bloom had known it would happen. Boylan had come at 4 o'clock, confident and physical, bringing gifts of fruit, bringing his masculine energy into her bedroom. She remembered the details, his touches, his words, the way he moved, the satisfaction and the slight disappointment mixed together. Because it hadn't been quite as wonderful as she had imagined it might be. Boylan was attractive certainly, virile and confident, but there was something mechanical about him too, something that didn't quite touch her deepest self. He was an experience, a pleasure, a rebellion perhaps, but not the romantic transformation she had half hoped for. Her thoughts drifted to Bloom, to the man now sleeping beside her in his curled position, taking up so little space in their bed. She thought about their history together, how they had met, how he had courted her, how different he was from other men. He wasn't forceful or domineering like her father, like Boylan. He was gentle, curious, attentive in his way, though not always in the ways she wanted him to be. She remembered the day on Heath Head when he had proposed, when she had said yes. She remembered the passion they had shared then, the intensity of their early love. She remembered how he had kissed her, how she had fed him seed cake from her mouth, how the world had seemed full of promise and possibility. What had happened to that passion? When had it faded? She knew the answer. It was after Rudy died, after they lost their baby son. Something had broken between them then. Some channel of intimacy had closed. They hadn't made love in years now, hadn't had that full connection that marriage was supposed to provide. And yet, Bloom was still there. He was still her husband, still the man who made her breakfast, who worried about her, who remained faithful in his way despite her betrayals. She thought about his kindness, his peculiar gentleness, the way he noticed small things and tried in his quiet manner to please her. Her mind wandered to other men she had known, old lovers, brief flirtations, the lieutenant at Gibraltar when she was young, the various men who had desired her over the years. She had always been attractive, always known the power of her body and her beauty, always been aware of male attention as a constant presence in her life. She thought about singing, about her upcoming concert too that Boylan was organizing, about her voice and whether it was really good enough for professional success, whether she was fooling herself. She had talent, certainly, but was talent enough? At her age, with her limited training, could she really make something of her musical ambitions? Her thoughts turned practical, thinking about money, about household matters, about her daughter Millie growing up and working in Mullingar, about whether Bloom's advertising business would provide enough income, about all the mundane concerns that occupied a woman's mind even when she was also thinking about love and betrayal and meaning. She thought about religion, about God and faith and whether she believed any of it. She had been raised Catholic, but so much of it seemed like rules made by men to control women, to make them feel guilty for their bodies and their desires. Did she believe in God? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depended on her mood, on the day, on what she needed to believe. Her mind returned to Bloom again, circling back as thoughts do in the middle of the night. She wondered where he had been all day, what he had done, whether he knew about Boylan's visit. Of course he knew. Bloom noticed everything, understood more than he ever said. He had probably spent the day wandering around Dublin, knowing what was happening at 4 o'clock, unable to stop it but carrying the knowledge with patient endurance. She felt a wave of tenderness for him mixed with exasperation. Why didn't he do something? Why didn't he fight for her, demand her fidelity, assert himself as a husband should? But even as she thought this, she knew that his gentleness was part of why she had chosen him, why she stayed with him despite everything. Molly's thoughts flowed on, touching on dozens of topics, past and present, desire and duty, memory and sensation all mixing together. She thought about flowers, about Gibraltar where she had grown up, about the warmth and colors of that Mediterranean place so different from grey Dublin. She thought about her mother, about being young and beautiful and full of possibility. And she thought about the future, what would happen now, whether she would continue with Boylan, whether her marriage to Bloom would change or simply continue in its current pattern, whether there was still time for transformation, whether this was simply what life was. this mixture of disappointment and contentment, betrayal and loyalty, desire and resignation. She became aware that Bloom had asked her something before falling asleep, something about breakfast, about what she wanted him to bring her in the morning. Even after the day he had endured, knowing what had happened, he was still thinking about her comfort, still planning to serve her breakfast in bed. This touched her more than Boylan's passion had. This daily kindness, this patient care, wasn't this love too? Perhaps a deeper kind of love than the excitement of an affair? Bloom had his faults, certainly. He wasn't everything she wanted in a husband. But he was there. He was steady. He cared. Her thoughts returned to that day on Heath Head, to the moment when she had said yes to his proposal. She remembered the feeling of that moment, the sun, the sea, the sense of possibility, the rightness of saying yes to this unusual man who loved her so completely. And now, lying in the darkness with the evidence of her betrayal still present in the room, with Bloom sleeping beside her in his patient way, Molly felt her thoughts moving toward a kind of acceptance, a kind of affirmation. Yes, she had betrayed him. Yes, their marriage was complicated and imperfect. Yes, she had desires and needs that he couldn't or wouldn't fulfill. But he was still her husband, still the man she had chosen, still the one who remained beside her through everything. Her mind flowed on through the darkness, touching memories and sensations, past and present, until finally her thoughts came to rest on that single word, that affirmation that had marked the beginning of her life with Bloom and now, perhaps, marked a kind of renewal, a choosing of him again despite everything. Yes, she thought. Yes, to life with all its complications. Yes, to desire and love and betrayal and forgiveness. Yes, to the strange marriage she had with this strange man. Yes, to Bloom and to herself and to whatever the future would bring. Yes, to the day on Heath Head and to all the days that had followed. Yes, to the mystery of it all, to being alive, to being a woman with all her contradictions and desires and tender mercies. Yes, and with that final affirmation, Molly Bloom surrendered to sleep, joining her husband in rest as dawn approached and June 16, 1904, finally, completely ended.